For centuries, people have imagined Vikings running around in horned helmets, pillaging villages and looking like heavy metal mascots. But as it turns out, they probably looked a lot less like that and a lot more like this. Hi, it's me and this is my channel. For decades, historians have spent a great deal of time rolling their eyes at the whole horned helmet thing. There is no evidence that Vikings ever used them, they say, and the idea that they did is a harmful myth that has made it into popular culture. But archaeology sometimes has a funny way of flipping the script. In 2019, an excavation at a Bronze Age site in Denmark turned up 2 ceremonial helmets decorated with horns. They date back to around 1800 BC, which is at least 15 centuries before the Viking Age. That would mean the horned helmet wasn't entirely a fabrication. Some version of it actually had ancient ceremonial roots. Now, while these helmets do look a bit like what people imagine a Viking helmet might look like, that's mostly because most people imagine Viking helmets based on a handful of 19th century drawings by Danish artist and archaeologist Jørgen Vestergaard. But those drawings were made at a time when people were really into a style called Nordicism, which was basically a celebration of all things Viking. And they show Vestergaard's real agenda, which was to make ancient Scandinavian culture look as romantic and heroic as possible. He wasn't trying to draw what an actual Viking helmet looked like. He was drawing what he thought an actual Viking helmet should look like. But these new archaeological finds, well, they tell a different kind of story. The horns on the ceremonial helmets were made by fixing a pair of long, curved husks from an extinct species of wild cattle onto a bronze hat-like object made of hammered sheet metal. These helmets were unused in battle because the cattle were only around for a few centuries before going extinct around 1900 BC, and there is no evidence that the people who wore these helmets were in the habit of raiding and pillaging, like the Vikings did a millennium or so later. Instead, archaeologists think these helmets were used in rituals related to the worship of a chief, possibly even a chief who was considered divine. These days, the horned helmets are on display at the National Museum of Denmark in Copenhagen. Now, these may be the oldest examples of horned helmets that have survived, but they definitely aren't the last. Similar examples have been found across Europe, and some have even turned up in places as far away as Siberia. And that brings us back to the Vikings, or more specifically, the word Viking. During the Viking Age, which lasted from the 8th to the 11th century AD, Scandinavia was home to a whole bunch of different cultures that spoke related, but not exactly mutually intelligible languages. We call them the North Germanic peoples. And the word Viking was one of many ways to refer to them. The Vikings themselves generally referred to themselves by the name of the culture they belonged to, like Dane, Norwegian, or Swedish. They also had other names that were more like titles. A common one was Jarl, which indicated that someone was a member of the ruling class. Another one was Kar, which literally meant man but could also function as a kind of honorific. In other words, it was a title you give to a warrior who had proven himself in battle. We don't know exactly who coined the term Viking, but it seems to have originated somewhere outside Scandinavia and carried a less than flattering meaning. One theory suggests it came from the Old Norse word vikingr, which referred to a type of seafaring warrior who went on raids. Another theory says it comes from the Old English word for Viking, wiork, which means evil. Do with that information what you will. By the 13th century, the term Viking had evolved to encompass all members of the North Germanic cultures, both good and bad. By then, though, it was already starting to fade out of use. Today, we use it to refer to a specific historical period and culture, not an ethnicity or nationality. So, if the Vikings themselves wouldn't have called themselves Vikings, were the horned helmets really such a stretch? No, they weren't. The Vikings absolutely had horned helmets, just not in the way people usually imagine. The horned helmets weren't used in battle. They were used in rituals. The Vikings didn't storm Christian monasteries with horns strapped to their heads, but that didn't stop the idea from taking root. As often happens with myths, it just got recycled and misattributed. So can we put this one to bed now, please? So what do you think? Does it feel good to finally know the truth about horned helmets? Let me know in the comments below, and remember, If you want to learn more about the Vikings, there's plenty more where that came from. So, you know how everyone jokes that medieval knights were so weighed down by their armor that if they fell, they couldn't get back up? Basically, medieval turtles. Turns out those jokes might not be too far from the truth. Hi, it's me and this is my channel. In 2014, researchers in Austria set out to reconstruct the full plate armor of a 5th-10th century knight. Once they had it, they put it on some highly trained athletes and filmed them doing stuff. And yes, that is the sound that my brain makes when reading this incredible footage. I mean, just look at this thing. It weighs about 60 pounds, which is heavier than an average adult turtle. And yet these super strong dudes were somehow able to run in it, mount horses, and even do somersaults. Yes, a knight in 60 pounds of steel could still flip like a gymnast, but it took a lot out of them. And while we can all agree that mounting a horse and that would be pretty difficult, the real problem was that the armor restricted the wearer's stamina, not their mobility. As the researchers noted, the men quickly tired because the armor demanded so much energy to move around in. And I can only imagine what it would be like to have someone constantly whispering in your ear, "You're too slow, you're too slow, you're too slow." Well, actually, that was probably what the other knights were yelling during battle, but you get the point. So while the walking tank image is somewhat true, it turns out that knights weren't helpless if they fell over. But being covered head to toe in metal was definitely a workout. And just getting dressed in the morning required the help of a valet. Just getting dressed in the morning required the help of a valet. In fact, putting on armor was a big production, sort of like a medieval game show where one knight would try to dress another in the fastest time possible. For a knight, being armored head to toe took about 30 minutes. And for the poor guy helping him, it took about 45. Not only did the armor weigh 60 pounds, it also consisted of dozens of interlocking metal plates that needed to be carefully fastened together. Some armors even had a separate skirt for the horse, which added another layer of complexity. But once the knight was dressed, he would join his fellow warriors in the courtyard for some morning exercises. After all, they didn't want to start the day with a case of tennis elbow. But it wasn't exactly light work. Putting on that armor was like trying to run a marathon in full gear. The whole undertaking burned over 1,200 calories per hour. No wonder why knights were often drenched in sweat after a morning of training. And that's a good thing, right? Wrong. See, the more advanced the armor, the less protection it provided against the elements. As weapons improved and became deadlier, knights needed better armor to protect themselves. But as armor got stronger, it also became thinner. And thin armor meant that a knight was more vulnerable to rain, snow, heat, and cold. Not to mention the constant threat of getting sunburned. By the end of the 5th-10th century, some knights wore lighter armor made out of leather or linen. But that was considered low class. Most high-status knights stuck it out in metal even if it meant getting exhausted and sunburnt. Armor was so exhausting that a knight could only fight effectively for 2 hours per day. After that, they were too tired to do much of anything besides walk back to the castle and sleep. Sunburn was also a constant threat. And if a knight got too burnt, their skin would blister and their armor would rub against their wounds, causing even more pain. Despite the exhaustion and discomfort, knights continued to wear heavy armor for several centuries. After all, it was a status symbol that showed their rank and power. Plus, they probably figured if they got too hot or sweaty, they could just take off their helmet and cool down, right? No, knights never removed their helmets in battle unless they wanted to die. Being inside a helmet was the only way to protect your face and head from the enemy, and it was really the only part of the armor that a knight could safely take off. During battle, if a knight removed their helmet, they were opening themselves up to getting stabbed in the neck or decapitated. And let's face it, it would be pretty hard to put it back on once your head was separated from your body. So maybe those jokes about knights being like turtles aren't so far off after all. And perhaps it was the exhaustion that made some knights surrender upon seeing the enemy. But it takes a lot of energy to stay upright in 60 pounds of metal. If you've ever tried to walk in something like a backpack full of lead, you know exactly what I mean. Now check out what a day in the life of a medieval peasant was like, or watch this video instead. You've heard it. Medieval people believed the earth was flat. If you sailed too far, you'd fall off the edge of the world. Historians have long dismissed this as nonsense. Educated people knew the earth was round, they say, because educated people have always known the earth is round. The idea that it's flat is a modern misconception. Except what if I told you that this time, legend has it that many ordinary villagers really did think the earth was flat. And I'm not talking about some isolated flat earthers in the most remote hamlets. I mean people who lived hundreds of miles from the coast, from any port at all, and were unlikely ever to see a ship. How could they have believed such a thing? Hello and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to find out how real the legend of the flat earth really was. The idea that the earth is flat isn't a new one. It pops up in various ancient cultures throughout history. But by the Middle Ages, most educated Europeans knew that it was round. Greek and Roman cartographers had accurately mapped the earth's circumference centuries before. And anyone who'd taken the time to study their maps would know it. Not only that, but many medieval scholars had actually circumnavigated the globe themselves, or at least the known world. Marco Polo, for instance, had traveled across Asia and documented his adventures in a famous book. When he returned to Europe, he brought with him tales of strange lands and exotic people. But he also knew very well that the earth was round, so why did people still believe it was flat? Well, the answer might surprise you. Recent research suggests that the medieval flat earthers weren't ignorant peasants who never left their villages. They were, in fact, highly sophisticated scholars who devoted their lives to uncovering the secrets of the cosmos. Take Richard of Wallingford, an English monk who wrote a book about astronomy in the 13th century. He knew that the earth was round, but he thought it was flat. Confusing, I know. But it makes more sense if you consider that Richard was part of a theological tradition that believed the earth was the center of creation. As he saw it, God created the heavens and the earth. Then he placed everything in motion. The sun, moon, and planets moved through fixed positions in the sky like actors on a stage. This idea that the earth was at the center of creation was widespread in medieval thought. It was popularized by a man named Ptolemy, whose star catalog described the positions of over 1,000 stars. Ptolemy's work was hugely influential and was used by scholars throughout the medieval period. It wasn't until the 16th century that Copernicus came along and turned the Earth into a planet, knocked it off its pedestal, and made the sun the center of the solar system. But back to Richard of Wallingford. His writings are an example of how medieval scholars could be both highly intelligent and thoroughly convinced the Earth was flat. You see, Richard wasn't a peasant. He was a monk who devoted his life to studying the heavens. But his beliefs were actually pretty typical of the educated elite of his time. They just believed in a geocentric universe. But what about the common people? Were they really as ignorant as they're often made out to be? Well, surprisingly, no. Medieval peasants also knew that the earth was round. In fact, one scholar estimated that as late as the 19th century, fewer than 10% of Europeans believed the earth was flat. So where did the myth come from? Well, it turns out that there's evidence of flat earthers all across Europe, from England to Germany to Italy. But they weren't all ignorant peasants. Some were actually quite well educated. For instance, there's the story of a German Dominican preacher who went around telling people that if you sailed west, you'd eventually reach India. Only he didn't mean it in the way you think. See, he wasn't suggesting that the earth was flat. He was actually trying to prove that it was round. He argued that if the earth was flat, then sailing west would take you off the edge of the world. But it didn't, therefore the earth must be round. Problem solved. The point is, this idea was so ingrained in medieval culture that it did and need to be believed in order to be talked about. People discussed it, debated it, and even joked about it. Just like we do today? But the difference is that back then, there were actually two sides to the argument, not just one. In other words, the medieval flat earth wasn't just a myth. It was half true. The educated elites and scholars of the time laughed at the idea of a flat earth, but the peasants in remote villages, they actually whispered about falling off the edge of the world because they didn't have access to the same information as the elites. They couldn't see the ships that proved the earth was round. And without that evidence, they were perfectly happy living in a flat world. Thanks for watching. Bye. When you hear the phrase Iron Maiden, you probably think of two things: the legendary heavy metal band or their mascot, Eddie, who is usually depicted as an emaciated corpse emerging from a coffin. The iconic image is so burned into our collective consciousness that we immediately assume any coffin lined with spikes is an Iron Maiden, even though the band didn't actually invent this particular brand of coffin. In fact, it was popularized by 19th century showmen who claimed these were authentic relics of the Middle Ages, as far-fetched as it sounds. Scientists initially agreed. For decades, the consensus among historians and archaeologists was that there was no evidence of spiked coffins in the Middle Ages, meaning the entire thing was a hoax cooked up to sell tickets in freak museums. The story goes that during the 1840s, showmen began advertising these relics of barbarism, charging admission for the privilege of viewing them. This naturally led to a cottage industry of forgeries. The coffins were likely made by Italian immigrants who adapted old wine casks by hammering nails into them, creating convincing-looking relics of a supposedly more savage past. This explanation seemed to make sense. After all, why would medieval Europeans go to the trouble of lining a coffin with spikes? It offended against the Christian duty. To bury the dead with dignity and the practicality of nailing someone up inside a wooden box seems questionable at best. Given how infrequently we find archaeological evidence of the Iron Maiden, it's easy to believe that they were mostly, if not entirely, a product of the 19th century. After all, we have plenty of contemporary accounts of people being put to death by hanging, burning, and even being sewn up in lead-lined coffins. Why would anyone go to the trouble of experimenting with something as elaborate and unsettling as an Iron Maiden? But some historians have questioned whether the lack of evidence is evidence of lack. In other words, just because we haven't found much physical evidence of the Iron Maiden doesn't mean it didn't happen. That's especially true when we consider the surviving physical evidence we do have. Scattered across museum collections are pieces of coffin from the late Middle Ages, specifically the 5th, 10th, and 16th centuries, which feature small iron spikes driven into the wood. On the surface, they don't seem to be part of any larger pattern. They're just fragments of broken coffins with a few nails in them. But in 2021, researchers uncovered an illustrated manuscript from the late 5th, 10th century depicting a very similar sight, a coffin being lowered into a grave with several iron rods protruding from beneath its lid. Based on these fragments and paintings, along with contemporary literary sources describing spiked coffins, it looks like the Iron Maiden wasn't exactly a common form of execution, but it certainly wasn't a complete fabrication either. While the nails used on these coffins were small and wouldn't have been lethal on their own, they could have been used to secure larger objects like iron bars, meaning the possibility of lethal force is still present. Also, the act of nailing someone up inside a coffin would have been horrifying regardless of whether or not those nails could kill you. The whole point of public executions was deterrence. By making an example of someone in their final moments, the hope was to prevent others from following in their footsteps. So, an Iron Maiden might not have been the everyday torture machine of Hollywood, but it certainly wasn't pure fiction either. Instead, it was a terrifying blend of rare but real practice and later exaggeration. Now, thanks to modern technology, we can recreate these gruesome historical events in virtual reality. You can experience what it would have been like to be nailed up inside an Iron Maiden for yourself by visiting a museum's online collection. There, you will also find additional resources to help you learn more about the history of this notorious relic of the past. Speaking of relics, click here to learn about the strange and brutal history of the thumbscrew. Or click here to watch this video instead. For centuries, stories spread of medieval people creating witch bottles filled with nails, hair, and urine to curse or protect against witches. Historians once thought this was folklore invented much later, but archaeological digs across England uncovered dozens of real witch bottles buried under thresholds, hearths, and even church floors. Some contained rusty pins and odd liquid residues still intact after 400 years. Turns out, people really did believe they could trap evil spirits in a bottle, mixing superstition with everyday survival. The myth turned out to be one of the most literal truths of the medieval world. Magic was bottled, hidden, and feared. I'm your host, and this is the channel. Now, those little bottles are called witch bottles because they were supposedly created to capture witches in the act of cursing someone. Medieval people believed that witches could harm you by sticking pins in dolls made of wax or cloth representing you. And the witch bottle was designed to capture that evil spirit in the act of cursing. You would then bury the bottle upside down under a threshold or in a hearth to protect yourself from further harm. But as effective as these little bottles may have been at protecting people from witches, they haven't exactly been super helpful to historians trying to understand what life was like in medieval England. That's because the ingredients used in these witch bottles were pretty universal, consisting of things like dirt, urine, blood, animal parts, and various plants. So, unless we happen to find a bottle with a label, we don't really know what any particular one was supposed to do. What we do know is that people began making these bottles sometime around the 15th century when the fear of witchcraft was at its peak. And that fear was not without reason. During the 14th and 15th centuries, there was a baleful and deadly epidemic sweeping across Europe, killing nearly half of those it infected. And because no one knew what caused the illness, people began looking for someone to blame. Enter the witch craze. People began accusing one another of causing the illness through witchcraft, and over 60,000 people were put to death as a result. These accusations didn't stop at the wealthy elite. In fact, it was often the poor who suffered the most, accused by the desperate and powerful of using their magic for an unfair advantage. To combat these accusations and any curses placed upon them by a vengeful witch, people turned to a variety of means to protect themselves, including burying these cursed bottles filled with nails, hair, and urine under their thresholds. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, people across England, Wales, and the south of Scotland buried over 500 of these bottles. And while it seems that most of them were created to protect against a curse, some were meant to harm. One particularly nasty variation on the witch bottle was the cursing bottle, which might contain things like a dead mouse, a toad, or even a lump of coal. This ingredient list makes sense when you consider the etymology of the word curse, which comes from the Old English word for a kind of magic that causes harm. Today, only about 40 of these bottles remain, along with a few stray accounts from the time period. But the archaeological record suggests that at one point they were widespread across Britain. The ingredients may have varied, but the intent was always the same: to trap the chaotic forces of evil magic and keep it from doing harm. It may sound crazy, but when you're desperate, you try anything. And sometimes that means turning to magic, even if it's bottled. There's a common stereotype of medieval doctors hacking away at people with rusty saws, letting blood with leeches, and then praying that the patient didn't die. It seemed like such a horrifyingly barbaric practice that many people believed all surgery was like this. But recent findings have shown that this couldn't be further from the truth. A new analysis of over 200 medieval surgical instruments found that many were highly advanced for their time. For example, skull trepanations, or the process of drilling a hole into the skull, were actually done so well that some patients fully healed with minimal infection. And a 13th century operation to remove cataracts used delicate needles to dissolve the cloudy lens blocking a patient's eye so it could be sucked out. Even battlefield amputations, which we think of as gruesome and desperate measures, were done with a shocking level of sophistication. One surgeon described the process of removing a soldier's leg in just 15 minutes, and many patients survived the ordeal. It turns out that medieval surgeons wrote lots of detailed manuals about their work, some of which were shockingly accurate compared to what we know about medicine today. But of course these wouldn't be medieval medical texts if there wasn't some really bad stuff in there too. Surgery was still done without anesthesia, so it hurt like crazy. And while surgeons did their best to prevent infection, plenty of patients died as a result. But the idea that medieval surgeons were clueless butchers was only partly true. Medieval surgery was actually quite skillful, with some techniques that modern doctors wouldn't be out of place today. Take a look at this medieval depiction of a surgeon stitching up a wound. Compare it to this 19th century illustration of a surgeon stitching up a similar wound. The tools and techniques are basically identical. Medieval surgeons were also surprisingly experimental. This 16th century illustration shows a surgeon using a syringe to inject a liquid into a patient's vein. And while the idea of injecting things into veins seems pretty standard today, this was actually the first written record of the technique. The surgeon who described it was so precise about how to do it that scientists believe he may have invented the syringe. So while it's true that medieval medicine had its share of, let's say, less than effective practitioners, the people who actually performed surgery were often highly skilled and surprisingly sophisticated. To learn more ways that medieval science was more advanced than you might think, stay tuned for more information. In July 1518, a woman was strolling through the German city of Strasbourg when she began dancing uncontrollably. She danced for days. When she finally stopped, she collapsed and died. At the time, this bizarre occurrence was recorded by an eyewitness. She wished to go to the cemetery, but on the way fell down dead. He wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, dozens of men and women would experience similar symptoms, collapse, and die. This horrifying event became known as the Dancing Plague of Strasbourg. And although it was long thought to be a myth, historians now believe it really happened. So what caused these people to dance themselves to death? Let's get into it. In the summer of 1518, a woman named Frau Troffea was out for a walk when she started dancing erratically in the streets. The eyewitness who wrote about the event did not know the cause of her strange behavior at the time, but he would soon find out. As the dancing continued day after day, it became clear that something was wrong. On July, the city council sent 2 doctors to investigate. They concluded that the dancing sickness was caused by an imbalance of the 4 humors, which was a medical theory at the time. This idea suggested that the body had to maintain a balance of blood, phlegm, yellow, and black bile in order to stay healthy. An imbalance would cause illness and disease. To bring the humors back into balance, the doctors prescribed a treatment that is both horrifying and hilarious by today's standards. They recommended whipping the dancing patients to drive the disease out of them, and things didn't stop there. As more and more people were stricken with the dancing sickness, the treatments became even more extreme. Some patients were sewn up in leather suits, likely to keep them from harming themselves while dancing. Others were put into cold baths or had ice water poured over them. But nothing worked. People continued to dance until they dropped from exhaustion, and some even died. In total, between July and September of 1518, 400 people were reported to have died from dancing themselves to death. It seemed as though the entire city of Strasbourg was doomed. But then, just as suddenly as it started, the dancing plague stopped. The eyewitness wrote that the sickness simply vanished, although this was likely because most of the city's residents had died and those who survived developed immunity to whatever it was that caused the plague. Still, the event was so bizarre that it seemed almost unbelievable. Mass hysteria was the prevailing theory among historians for centuries, but this explanation didn't sit well with everyone. After all, mass hysteria isn't usually fatal. Other historians blamed religious mania, suggesting that the people of Strasbourg were overwhelmed with guilt over their sins, which caused them to dance frantically until they died. Again, this didn't seem quite right. There was no religious fervor or persecutions occurring in Strasbourg at the time, so what could have caused the dancing plague? Some researchers believe the culprit was ergot poisoning, a hallucinogenic fungus that can grow on rye bread. When flour made from infected rye is baked, the fungus remains in the bread and can cause a number of strange symptoms. These include convulsions, hallucinations, delusions, and uncontrolled dancing. In other words, all the symptoms of the dancing plague. There was even an ergot epidemic in Germany in the year 1517, although it's unclear if the fungus also caused the dancing plague. Researchers don't know how widespread the consumption of ergot-infected bread was at the time, making it difficult to say for sure. However, the timing does add weight to the theory. But whether the dancing plague was caused by contaminated bread or some other factor, the event serves as a reminder of just how fragile life is. It also shows how little we understand about the world around us. Even something as common as bread can turn deadly if circumstances are just slightly different. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our content on the Black Death. Thanks for watching.